difficult.
A couple of things happened during the time that that I understand you were closely affiliated with the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and I want to ask you about two of them. First, that in 1936, Charlotte Whitten resigned, or was asked to resign from the Canadian Association of Social Workers.
Asked to?
Were you involved in that at all?
I didn't remember that she did resign. I didn't remember. I don't remember her closeness to the CASW. Again, geography. But I didn't remember. I know that she turned to us on the placement committee, asking for suggestions. I remember one in relation to Winnipeg. I remember a number of them seeking suggestions. No, not usually. She had somebody in mind, and she didn't like the way the placement service worked because we insisted on more than one being suggested to a board of directors. But that was my only link with her in the association. She was in Ottawa and all over the place, and I in Toronto, where the national office of the CASW then was. Mm-hmm. But I don't remember her resigning. As I said, I don't remember much her. I didn't know her work as a member. Mm-hmm. She believed in qualified people, and emphasized that no end with Mr. Bennett and Mr. King and with boards of directors searching for somebody. But I didn't remember that she. Did you say that she was asked to?
This is my understanding, which of course comes from something I read, not from something I know firsthand. But my understanding was that she was asked to resign because she didn't have adequate qualifications to be a social worker.
Well, I don't know about that. I never heard of it. The CASW at that point, and in my experience, always thought in terms of qualifications for a professional association. I do recall controversy over the acceptance of Dr. Cassidy as a member. Dr. Cassidy hadn't done social work in what was considered an orthodox way. I mean, he came to it from an academic, purely academic and way. And I remember fighting for his being included among a clause in the Constitution that made it possible for exceptional people without the usual requirements. Mm-hmm. He hadn't been to a school of social work. He was teaching in one. Yeah. But he became a member. Yeah. But I don't remember how Charlotte.
Another thing that I want to ask you about that happened around the same time, again about 1936, was there was a 1936.
36?
In Ottawa, there was a change in the administration of public welfare, where it had been administered by social workers, and because of some difference of opinion, the social workers who had been administering relief, I understand, were fired, and unqualified people hired to administer relief. Miss Bessie Tuzel was a person who was at the forefront of that action, and I guess was the first to resign when such a thing took place. Were you at all, as part of the National Association, involved or cognizant of what was going on in Ottawa at that time?
Did you say that Bessie was one of the people that was fired?
I don't know whether she was fired or resigned.
Oh, yes, but I mean, because of the resignation of because of the firing of others, probably. Only vaguely do I remember that. I remember Bessie's able work and the work of, I remember one other worker that I've had contact with since, because of her living with another social worker that I know well, but I don't remember that except very vaguely.
Mm-hmm.
I'll speak later about my coming in the latter part of my sojourn in the school, toward the end of the 30s and until I left in 45. I was able, with Dal Grauer's encouragement, to spend 2 months of the summer break every other year in going to an agency and really working in it. I didn't want to get ivory towered, although to suggest art work in the school, full as it was certainly not ivory towerish, but when you're teaching a method of work, which is actually doing, it's an art, you have to keep close. And on one occasion, I went for that period of every summer was too heavy, too much. But every other year seemed to work well, and I had a couple of months with in Bessie in the public department in Ottawa. Major Ford was in charge, as I recall. But anyway, it was with Bessie that I was working. It was not possible for me to do to come as close to things there as in the Children's Aid Society, for example, in London, Ontario, and again for two successive years, I went to Philadelphia to the Family Society there. In those agencies, I had a caseload and a wonderful experience. With the public welfare, with all its rulings, the minutiae. But I was there for a stretch, I think 2 months there, it was 2 months at the other places, and gained a lot of understanding of what they were up against.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I do remember the just vaguely, but had that anything to do with the CASW?
My understanding was that the CASW took it up as a cause, sort of a continuation of what Miss Whitten and others had been encouraging, which was the professionalization of public welfare. But if you weren't involved with it, then it's...
public welfare was so new. Everybody was feeling, that had anything to do with it, were feeling their way. But the sort of thing that Bessie did there, with one or two, not many, that were qualified people, but a host of others that weren't qualified, and the way what she was standing for got through to the ones that weren't, was very real.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure we deplored, but I didn't have anything to do with it.
No,
it wasn't close.
That's okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can stop for just a second.
Mm-hmm. But coming back to the period that I was been talking about when Professor Urwick was there, undoubtedly there were prickles, as Agnes McGregor said once, between the social work community and the School of Social Work. The community were bothered by the presence in the curriculum of these social sciences, which people without a degree had to take before they, along with the more professional courses, before they could graduate. It was hard for them. And there were so many things that the community of social workers wanted that they were not getting in the school. More courses that are more directly affecting their day-by-day work. Whereas, on the other hand, Professor Urwick was doing his utmost to bring the school into a position of acceptance in the university. It had been regarded as sort of a poor little stepchild, and actually, it was through his effort that in the 30s that the school became much more accepted within the university, which in the long run was very important to the profession. But there was a alertness and a longing on the part of the social work community for more of the practical things. Well, Professor Urwick, before he left, the date doesn't matter, before he, about 37, I think, we had come much closer to acceptance. And the title of the school was changed to the Department of Social Science. The name didn't help the prickles any, but shortly after, we were accepted. We were could be regarded as something more or less reputable. Then came Dr. Dal Grauer, another Oxford man who was persona grata with the university, on the Royal Commission of Dominion and Provincial Relationships, an authority on legislation, social and labor legislation. He furthered the acceptance in the university, and in his day we became the School of Social Work. He also, and Dr. Jaffrey after him, moved out in relationship a bit into the community, into the social work community, and he realized things that they were longing for. And in Dal's sojourn, he made possible and arranged for short-time additions to the staff of outstanding social workers from the United States that came to give courses, refresher courses, to people in the community, and courses on supervision, notably for the student supervisors. There were courses, Brock Chisholm gave a course on the development of on human development through the years, an excellent course. And there was another psychiatrist that came for a short time. Dr. Chisholm's was over a longer period, but not a permanent thing. And these courses all helped, as also, and as I say, the prickles began to melt. If prickles melt. Just a minute. Well, there was no question about the hope that was raised in the community and within the school staff itself during his sojourn. It was rich with possibilities. But alas, in 1939, very suddenly, he accepted a position in Vancouver, a notable position in what then was the BC Electric Company. And again, there was a gap after just 2 years. And again, Miss McGregor took over. I'll hurry on to Dr. Jaffrey came after a gap of about a year, or almost a year, and he, like Dal Grauer, came closer in his interests and his activities with the social work community. But as I said before, he had only been there a year or two and a half, maybe, years, when he fell ill and was absent. During his recovery, he realized what was happening, and he asked to be relieved of the directorship, but stayed on when he was better with the school, and took over work, as I recall, with the public welfare teaching. Mm-hmm. I remember during that gap of the illness, Agnes McGregor saying one day to me, "Well, you and I must be either mentally defective or unutterably tough." And she certainly was tough in spirit, but this against a physical limitation that we kept forgetting about because she handled it so amazingly. But she an illustration of her what she meant to the school.
She was ill.
Well, she had short absences, but she had a heart condition that was and had to be very careful. And as I say, she was tough as could be in spirit, though. Mm-hmm. Just a minute. No time wasted. Harry, the university stood right by us in trying to capture Harry Cassidy, and he did come after something of a break. But and hope again was renewed, both within the university and in the school, and by a majority, I think, in the community. Now, I'm going to stop the university story. Agnes said we must be tough. But I was getting exhausted after all these breaks and the rearrangement that had to be made during them. And I had been promised by two directors that I would have a sabbatical year. And Harry knew this. And when he came and we spoke of it, he said, well, and I understood him saying, not this year, Barbara, it was in mid-year he came, not this year, but maybe next. And then he was honest enough, and I understood that. He, the adjusting in the school. But he was honest enough to come back shortly after and saying, Barbara, I can't promise that. it may be 2 years before you can do it, 2 full years. And at this point, with very careful thought, I gave up the idea of a sabbatical and resigned. I couldn't have gone on. I was just drained.
May I ask, what were the issues for you during those years? You've mentioned the gaps, the changes in directors, the development of the profession. What was making it tough for you in those years?
The bulk of work. 3 people, when we didn't have a director, carrying the load. And these were times when the call for social workers was increasing. The Children's Aid Societies through the provinces were taking on qualified people, and once they had one, they called for more. And it was war. And new sorts of jobs were popping up. The factories that were making munitions needed social workers to handle all sorts of problems that occurred with the families of the people, of the workers in the factories. The Air Force and the Army and the Navy all wanted people to look after the many sorts of things that arose with the women's services, and the war brides from England and so on. More and more demands, and we should have been out seeking students to come to the department. They were coming, increasing. We had, in my day, I meant to get out my lists of the students and count what the average. I remember the 2 years ranged from the beginning of my sojourn to the end of it. I would say between 40 and 60 in the 2 years. But the more students, but no more staff, full-time staff. Mm-hmm. And so I went off after 3 or 4 months to the School of Social Work in Columbia University, and was there for 3/4 of a year. I'm not going to take time to speak of it, but it was a wonderful experience, getting to know personally and having real associations with the people whose books I had been using and knew so well. Mm-hmm. Walter Pettit was the director, but Gordon Hamilton, and Lucille Austin, and Dorothy Hutchison, and Florence Hollis, Fern Lowry, and so on, the caseworkers, to know them, really to know them, and to have an opportunity in an overall way to take stock, really to rethink my thinking about social work. Mm-hmm. Or social work.
Can you hold on for just a second while I change the tape?
Mm-hmm. Just a minute. You may ask why, from that experience, I should head for Vancouver. I'm wondering whether you, in your interviews with a lot of social workers, social veterans, social work veterans, have run across the phrase, the three wise women from the East?
I've heard that on a number of occasions. Who
Well,
were they?
I don't need to repeat.
Oh, please do,
was-
because the tape doesn't know.
Hmm?
The tape recorder doesn't know. I've heard it, but you tell us.
Oh no. Did you hear how they came to go
No, please go ahead.
from the East? Well,
No.
that's important. All right. You have heard of the three wise women from the East. Again, we come to Charlotte Whitton and the unspeakable contribution that she made to Canada and social work development in the surveys for which the Canadian Council was responsible throughout this period, the 1920s and the 1930s. To mention one of them only, the Vancouver, a survey of child welfare in British Columbia. 4 able people from Toronto came and were here really digging. They came because of the wisdom of one of the board members of the Children's Aid Society in Vancouver, who at a time when they had collected money and were planning for a bigger and better institution for the children, the increasing number of children that needed protection. They had the money, they had the architect's plans, were purring in anticipation when this board member said, "I think we shouldn't spend a cent until we have the opinion of the Canadian Welfare Council." And so Charlotte arranged for these 4 workers from Toronto to come.
Do you remember who the board member was? Remember the name?
No, but I can get it for you.
And also the name of the 4 people who came?
Yes. Well, Mr. R.E. Mills of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, director, was in charge. Margaret Nairn from the Neighborhood Workers Association, she was the secretary throughout. Miss Leela O'Gorman came from the Roman Catholic Family Agency, and Miss Vera Moberly from the Infants' Home in Toronto. Family understanding, work with families, work with children at various ages. As a result, the able report that came back to the board of the Children's Aid Society in Vancouver stunned them. But as a result, fortunately, the institution didn't get built, and the 3 wise women came from the East. 2 of them, Miss Laura Holland and Miss Zella Collins, to bring about a change in the plan of care for children, a change from institutions to foster homes, living with real families. They came. The 3rd member, Miss Mary McFedrin, came a year later. They came in 26. And a year later, Miss Mary McFedrin came to start a family service agency. In the as the report said, that was needed, hopefully, to give services to family before the child needed neglect. And so those 3 became known as the 3 wise women for the East, and they were all extremely able. I am glad to hear that you are going to be interviewing, perhaps you have, Kay Whitman, who was a much younger worker that came with Miss Holland and with Miss Collins to help them in this in the actual day-by-day work in the agency of the Children's Aid. She's now retired and lives here. She was not in Vancouver very long at the time, but she had a difficult time. You'll be hearing about their work, and her work that knocked her health out during the days of troubles with the Doukhobors, and the taking of babies away from their families and placing them in other kinds of settings. She broke down under it, but happily had a long service in Toronto after this. Well, at the time that I went to the school in Columbia, Mary McPhedran, whose agency, a sturdy young family service agency, was well on its way in development. And she wrote to me saying, when you come to the end of your stay in New York, be sure to tell me before you clinch with any agency a plan to work for them. We'd like to have you. So when that time came, and I was getting a number of offers from places in the United States, I wanted to come back to Canada. I didn't want to stay there, and Canada needed every person that they could get. And so, knowing Miss McPhedran and Elizabeth Grubb, who was her assistant, she actually had graduated from the University of Toronto School and came to me in Moss Park as a beginner, a very, very able person. She hadn't stayed long because she wanted the sort of setting which was not just seeing unemployed families, and had come and was her assistant. Well, at the time it happened, when I wrote to her, to Miss Fedrin, it so happened that Marjorie Smith, the head of the School of Social Work at UBC, had come to her saying, can you double the number of students that you take from us? And Mary McPhedran's reply characteristically was, no, not without bringing down standards, and I won't do that, and you don't want me to. At that time, there were only very, very few resources for students. Mary, the Children's Aid Society, and the Roman Catholic Children's Aid Society, and so on and so on. But this was 1939, and Marjorie Smith said, the reason I want you to take more is that the veterans will be coming home, and with their gratuities, many of them will be turning for education of various sorts. We want to be prepared for perhaps an influx of veterans. They've had real experience. They may be good. And to make a long story short, it was arranged that I should come to the Family Services Agency, but half my salary coming from the School of Social Work to take students in their field work. Additionally to those, the number already coming to the agency year by year, I agreed to come on condition that I be in the agency, and half my work would be agency work, in which I firmly believed, so on. And that remained the plan for about 10 years, when, by which time Miss Grubb had retired, and I was taking on more responsibility here. But my work through those early years was responsibility for 4 students, myself, and a further responsibility in keeping close to the other supervisors, student supervisors in the agency, being available to them, and they were doing good work. And my other and the other work was in carrying a number of cases which I wanted to do following my experience in the New York school when I'd had field work there in a small institution, an institution for the care of emotionally disturbed children. It was a fascinating experience, but I'm going to leave that out. Just a minute. Said in relation to my coming to the neighborhood workers, how fortunate I was to very soon after arrival to participate in a study of the agency's work made by the Family Service Association of America. It was my good fortune, in coming to the family services here in Vancouver to about 3 months afterwards, after coming, we had a visit of about a week from the regional worker on the staff of the Family Service Association of America, an able person who served the area up and down the West Coast. And this was 1946. The war had just ended, and the particular emphasis of that visit was her getting us involved in really thinking through what other member agencies of the Family Service Association of America were doing in current and future planning. Many of the agencies had special work because of war. And here and across Canada, the family agencies had done, and more than they, had worked for the government, for the Army, in relation to what they call, in relation to a department established called the Dependents Board of Trustees, which were prepared to give extra financial help over and above pay and allowance to soldiers in the 3 services to meet unusual and real requirements related to illness. Predominated, but there were a number of unusual circumstances that could have help. And the agencies where in the family services were asked to investigate the requests for such. I had nothing to do with them, of course. The war was over, but I learned in my day-by-day work in the agency, in the reading of records, of the quality of the kind of the work that had gone into those brief, often brief. Sometimes there were requests from those families being served by the agency, but often brief. The principles that they put into what they did, and as they told me, all they had learned about financing and so on, a rich experience for them, but a heavy one that had been pretty draining, and this not dislocating, but in addition to their regular work. So current and future planning, and that was what the emphasis was in the long discussion with the board, with the staff meeting, with and so on. Now, so I came to this sturdy, young family agency, a member of the Family Service Association of America, with approximately a dozen workers, social workers. And I knew before I came, that's why I came, one of the reasons I came was because of the emphasis that had always been uppermost with Ms. McFedrin to develop better and better standards and real quality of work. The way of doing so was very apparent at once, and it was really fun.
How did it show itself? The attention to better and higher quality of service. How did that show itself to you as someone who was coming in? Because of the nature of their work in the casework, reading the cases, really development had come, and the whole emphasis and the plan for bringing further development and quality to the work was carried out in a number of ways. Good supervision, ongoing service, ongoing learning through staff meetings. Every other staff meeting, they were weekly, was given over to the studying, a presentation of an article pertinent to something that was needing help, and maybe 2 or 3 workers having difficulty with this. An article that really came home, presented by one of the staff, or the presentation by one of the staff of a case they were carrying that may have been that was difficult, or that the supervisor knew would be effective learning for the others. Ongoing learning for the staff through regularly arranged psychiatric consultations. Dr. Byrne of the Child Guidance Clinic was the one that helped us. But before going to him, the worker set down her thinking, because they were mostly women still. The oncoming veterans changed that, but set down the best of her thinking on what the social study of the case had brought out, of what she had been trying to do in treatment. This had gone well, but that hadn't gone well. Can you help us? This was done in advance of the visit to the psychiatrist. He studied it, and supervisor and worker went and had half an hour with him, and so on. That consistently was carried through as one of the aids in ongoing. The FSAA visiting regional worker each year
and the literature that was coming from that organization, from the best of the family agencies throughout the United States, we had a library that was heavily used, and so on. Another, I think that, I was interested very soon to discover that Mrs. Teresa Kaufman came to the staff meetings, or to most of them. Some of them she weren't so appropriate, but to any that were appropriate, because Mary McPhedran had been talking with her, people drifted to Miss McPhedran for help. And Teresa came regularly to our staff meetings because she was the only worker in the Jewish family agency. And it's lonely being the only worker. And Mary McPhedran, come to our staff meetings. Well, she came, and what she threw in to all the learning that was going on was very real. Mm-hmm. It was a very happy arrangement for her, but for us too. And another thing that was very apparent, it was so conducive to learning, was that the opportunities for presenting in staff meeting a case or an article was spread among the staff. It wasn't just the top people. Mm-hmm. Also shared were opportunity to go to the annual institute of the FSAA, held somewhere up and down the West Coast. Usually they were for a week, and you really got into a learning situation. And that too was an opportunity that was spread among the staff, mm-hmm. not all the top ones, or to the conferences mm-hmm. of other sorts. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I understand was going on at some time during your tenure at the Family Service Bureau was the Joint Family Service Project. Were you going to mention that?
Yes, just a minute. I was just coming. You and I seem to, our minds work together. The agency's work, again, the third wise woman, always was introducing innovations.
Miss McPhedran?
Yes. She couldn't hear of a need without exploring it and wrestling with it and helping to bring it about if it seemed wise. And the Joint Family Services was one. Still another one innovation that had come much earlier, before my day, but I think it's interesting, was the supervised homemaker development in that agency. It was a little part of the agency's work, a much littler innovation than the development of the visiting homemakers in Toronto. It was a big service. During my stay, the supervised homemakers services never had more than 10 homemakers. But the particular thing that made it singularly fruitful was that the homemaker, carefully chosen, of course, had brought up children of her own, and so on, worked closely, was placed in a home that where already a family service caseworker was working, so that the caseworker and the homemaker worked together when mother was in hospital to support the father often the children, because there was service already being given, something was needing help. And the trauma of having mother in the hospital would have been greater if that homemaker hadn't helped, and if she had worked hand in hand with it was an excellent service. After my day, and only 10 or so, and only occasionally enough of them to share with the city social service, for example. But only 10 throughout the whole time I was in the services. But now, when they broke away, and it was long overdue, and developed on their own, while there wasn't a caseworker from the family service working in the homes to which the homemakers were placed. The one that had been in charge of the service in the family services went over with the agency into the new agency, and they had struggled to get as much of the value that had been felt because of the dual team in working, letting the homemakers in the new agency work with a supervisor. And still, that is the case. And from 10, in my day, the staff of the Community Homemakers Association of Greater Vancouver has over 500.
Oh my. What a growth.
Yes, I have a homemaker that comes every other week, and so on. Well, to the joint family services. 2 settlement houses, Lexington Christopher House in Toronto, here, Gordon House and Alexandra Neighborhood House, the directors of those 2, as I recall, quite separately, turned to Mary McPhedran and said, "We're bothered." Said precisely the same story. We're bothered because of the fact that there are children, mostly children, but adults, older ones too, that are coming to our neighborhood house, but never really get belonging. They come because it's a warm place to come, lonely ones often, or actors out. But they come and they either drift on the fringe of whatever they belong to in the neighborhood house, or else are kicking up trouble wherever they are. We've asked their parents, we've tried to interest their parents, we've told them about going to the family services. No. What can we do? Well, to make a long story short, the 2 directors of those houses and Mary McPhedran, had a number of sessions, and out of it came the joint family services, which led our agency to put into each of those houses an able worker for, I think it was 3 days a week. That worker, with the full staff, I mean the social work staff in the neighborhood house, worked together, pooling all the learning they could get about the trouble of this child that was on the fringe, or the actor out. And it was a social study by everybody in the house and the family worker, getting to know the child as best they could. Mm-hmm. Not asking a lot of questions, but doing things with him. and watching what he was doing in the whatever activity he was engaged in. The group workers learned a lot through this, and the caseworker learned a lot from them. And together they learned a lot about the child. It was usually, as they discussed this, their learning, it was a project, it was special. Week by week or bi-weekly, it was decided which of this team knew the child, had the closest relationship with him. And that person, be they the caseworker or the group worker, carried on the work with that particular child. And it varied among the who was one. And the caseworker, it usually was, who went to the home and tried to interest parents. It did sometimes, but often it proved very superficial. And the degree of pathology in the home became very evident. Nevertheless, the caseworker went on as trying to make a touch, and slowly, as with multi-problem families, often got in to a working basis. But together, the two methods combined to make for a very sensitive service that brought real results, each learning from the other. I'd like to tell you, but there's more about family services that I don't want to omit.
Okay.
About an example of that, but an example of what happened to various youngsters. There were amazing relationships made, and when the project ended,